All right. So as I thought about how to explain Putin's decision, and I should start by saying that from everything we know about the Russian system, it really is Putin's decision. This is not the result of some collaborative and collegial process of consultation. This is a one-man decision, albeit possibly influenced by an ever-shrinking circle of like-minded advisors. So we're talking about Putin's decision. And, there are two ways to go on this, and I've been debating colleagues now for a month. One is to say, there's no point in thinking about what's on Putin's mind and what he said in the past, that all that is really just a bunch of propaganda or excuses, and really this is a man filled with rage who's acting on impulse as an expression of rage. And I don't want to rule out the role of rage in all this at all. Or of emotion in Putin's decision-making, for sure. We do have extra chairs over here. So I don't want to rule that out. I'm ruling it in. Having said that, I think for us to understand, we need to understand what led to this rage. It's not as though this is a man who goes through every day angry at everybody for everything, as far as I can understand from what observers have said. So we need to understand what has fueled this rage. And really the best way to understand that, the rage is not something momentary. Okay? This is something that has been building for at least 2 decades, if not more, ever since Putin came to power, which was in 2000. And I think that we need to understand the environment to which Putin is responding, which is not to say that we should excuse or condone or apologize for anything that Putin may have believed or decided, but it is important that we understand it. Because if our objective is to understand what led to the invasion, we need to understand this, shall we say, history. And I'm not going to, one could arguably go back centuries in talking about this. I'm going to just go back from the time that Putin came to power as president in the year 2000. Okay? So to repeat then, the concerns on Putin's part that led him to make the decision to invade Ukraine didn't emerge suddenly. Right? They have been building over the course of 2 decades. And these concerns embrace and have embraced more than Ukraine. Ukraine has played a central role here, but the concerns are much broader than just Ukraine. So one way of going about this is to consider Putin's policies toward and thinking about Russia's relationship with its neighbors, okay? It's fair to say, judging both from inferring from actions but also from statements, that over the last 2 decades as president, his central preoccupation has been to undo what he has seen as the terrible damage to Russia, resulting from the collapse of the Soviet Union and with it the collapse of the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet-sponsored, Soviet-dominated alliance system. Okay? That's the central preoccupation, to do whatever he can to undo it. As everyone I'm sure knows the famous quote, the dissolution of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe in the 20th century. Whether one agrees with that or not, that's certainly the way he sees it. But it's also important to see that he also has felt that the dissolution of the Soviet-dominated alliance was part of that catastrophe, not a minor part. Okay? So it seems to me that Putin over the years has had 4 specific objectives. Okay? First and foremost, he saw that collapse as a body blow to Russia's status as a great power. This is important to Putin. I don't want to psychologize, I don't know the man, but there are those that say that he has identified very closely with the Russian state, with Russia, and whether he has or has not, the preservation or restoration, really, of Russia's great power status is of enormous importance to him. It has been. He has always wanted Russia to come back to the point of being recognized and respected by the other great powers and by the international community as a whole. And after the breakup for at least the first decade, that was really not the case, all right? It wasn't happening, okay? Source of frustration, number one. Secondly, restore a clearly defined and universally recognized privileged sphere of influence, as he calls it. That includes all of the post-Soviet states, or what some Russians call their near abroad. Okay. Thirdly, Putin has always been preoccupied not only with the external power and status of the Russian state, he's also been preoccupied with the internal power of the Russian state. It has been an objective of his from the moment that he came to power to enhance the power and stability of the Russian state, not only abroad but also at home, and prevent developments in Russia's neighborhood that could undermine that power. That's been critical for him. Okay. So his fourth objective has been to keep at bay a Western alliance which was formed to contain Russia's power, all right, and which has always, in his view, constituted a threat to Russian security. So it's very important to keep that at whatever distance, including physical distance that one could, and to prevent it from actually succeeding in containing Russia's power or threatening Russia's security. So what has he done in that regard? Well, his policies have really evolved over the course of his 2 decades in power. They have been shaped by his perceptions of what was going on inside the Russian Federation, inside Russia's neighborhood, and just beyond that neighborhood. Neighborhood defined as I just did, as he does, namely the former Soviet states. Okay? So these perceptions and these events that gave rise to them are critical to understanding Russia's conflict with Ukraine in general and Putin's decision to attack it. Okay. Perhaps to oversimplify, I would say that there have been 5 key moments, and I apologize for the lack of visuals. I had planned to use a document camera, which we don't have. There have been 5 key moments, you might say, in this evolution. 2 of them directly involving Ukraine, all 5 involving NATO. All right. So the first of these occurred in March of 1999, when 3 former Warsaw Pact members, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, became NATO members. So a real insult. This was the alliance that had made Russia secure, and now, in the end, these states are not only becoming neutral or abandoning that commitment, they are engaging in what from Putin's eyes was nothing less than traitorous behavior, joining the enemy camp. I have to say that at that time, 1999, he's not yet president. I don't think he really was focusing on foreign policy at the time. I don't think he had a clearly formulated foreign policy at that time. It wasn't his responsibility. He had very pressing domestic priorities, including a rising wave of domestic Islamist terrorism perpetrated primarily by Islamists in Chechnya, and his decision to start a war, second war, first one having failed, to defeat a Chechen rebellion. From what we can tell by sort of listening to him or watching his statements, by about 2002, okay, after becoming president, he was increasingly beginning to focus on foreign policy, especially on what was really most important to him, developments in Russia's neighborhood. That's what was important. And as he was coming to see it, this expansion of the Atlantic Alliance that had occurred 3 years before had substantially enhanced NATO's power vis-a-vis Russia. And that, of course, would make renewal of Russia's great power status all the more challenging, all the more problematic. Okay. More ominously, that expansion brought the NATO alliance uncomfortably close to Russia's neighborhood, to its vital sphere of privileged influence in Putin's eyes. Okay. Thinking a little bit differently, or putting it differently, Russia had always sought, going back to imperial days, some kind of buffer, and it usually sought it by imperial conquest, between the heart of Russian power and culture and the enemy, and the expansion of NATO, at the expense, you might say, of the former Soviet Pact, or on the dissolution of the Soviet Pact, had deprived Russia of that buffer. Okay? That, as he saw it, had been critical in guaranteeing Russian security since the end of World War II. Okay? It also, this NATO expansion, demonstrated the perfidy, the treachery of Western governments, okay? Which, as Putin came to believe, had made some commitments. Quite arguable just what was said by whom and when, but Putin, at any rate, seems to have believed that promises had been made at high levels that NATO would not expand to include former Warsaw Pact states. There had been a promise, as Putin saw it, and he had documents to prove it, that high-level officials had promised not to place a NATO army beyond the borders of Germany. And yet, that began to happen after 1999. Okay? In a speech that Putin gave in 2007, he actually quoted the Secretary General of NATO as having made this commitment that NATO, at the time, that NATO would not expand. And it did. And in exchange, Russia made a concession. It agreed to remove its troops from East Germany in the first half of the 1991, and it agreed to accept NATO's incorporation of a West German state. So Putin felt that a deal had been done, and now the signatories, the partners, not really signatories, this was never a formal deal on paper, but his interlocutors had gone back on their part of the deal. So in his eyes, this treacherous behavior seemed to prove that despite numerous protestations to the contrary, if anybody doubted, NATO remained hostile to Russia and a threat to Russia's control over its own neighborhood. Okay? Policy implication. It was incumbent on Putin to make clear, for Russia to make clear, that further expansion of NATO was completely unacceptable, okay, and would have grave consequences for the future of East-West relations. Second key moment, all right, in the evolution of Putin's policies toward Russia's neighbors came in March 2004, almost exactly 5 years after this first tranche of states, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland. Just 5 years after that were admitted. 3 more of Russia's neighbors were admitted. This time, the Baltic states, states that had actually been part of the Soviet Union. Okay? By this time, Putin had, for some years now, been drawing very clear and articulating very clear red lines. I was very amused the first time I saw it. You know, an exact translation, krasnaya linia, you know, a red line. And this is our red line, Putin had said, and others had said in the Russian leadership. And here, the red line was being blithely crossed by the NATO alliance. Now a direct challenge to his concept of this vital, privileged sphere of influence that was being now, you know, stolen. Right? And now, with this move, the NATO alliance is clearly right on Russia's borders, okay? Significantly enhancing the threat to Russian security. Now, we're talking 2004. Russia, for a variety of reasons I don't have time to go into, was still too weak militarily to do much in response, mainly because it was still too weak economically. Okay? But Putin's fierce determination to halt, even reverse NATO's expansionist program, and exclude the West from Russia's privileged sphere, I think began to take shape in his mind at that time. We have to do something. We have to act. As soon as we're ready to do it, and we think we have a chance of success, we have to act. To this, otherwise, this process will know no bounds. It will continue. Very key moment. We're coming closer to Ukraine. Okay. In this evolution of Russian policies under Putin. Policies toward Russia's neighbors came later the same year, between November 2004 and January 2005. And those events, probably most of you have heard about, came to be known as the Orange Revolution. The Orange Revolution. In a couple of sentences, widespread anger in Ukraine at the announced outcome of a manifestly fraudulent runoff election sparked mass protests and strikes, unceasing day and night, day after day, for months, strikes throughout the whole country that brought the economy to a standstill. Finally, the Ukrainian government at the time, which was pro-Russian, agreed to hold a new runoff, and the pro-Western candidate was announced the winner. Well, from everything we can tell, and again, this is, you know, we don't have super good intelligence here, but from everything we can tell, Putin was astonished as well as horrified when this happened. He had worked very hard to ensure, by means of propaganda and infiltration of cash, that advising that the pro-Russian candidate was going to win this election, enabling Russia to exert very substantial influence over Ukraine's foreign policy. And thereby, it would be enough if the pro-Russian candidate had won to keep Ukraine from being the next casualty in this, from Putin's eyes, in this expansionist program. Okay. But the pro-Russian candidate lost. All right. And now, Russia's control of its immediate neighborhood was being challenged from within by political developments within. Putin, and he wasn't the only one. When I say Putin, this was not uniformly and not universally, but very widely shared position among Russian elites. Putin attributed this electoral outcome to Western meddling. And I should tell you that there's a lot to that case. This is an election on which everybody who cared about sort of Russia and Russian foreign policy had been watching, and there were advisors of every size and stripe, from NGOs to college students. There were kids from IU that went, but political advisors who were advising the pro-Western candidate on how to run a campaign and how to win an election. And Putin blamed that meddling, that interference in democratic processes in another country on the West. Okay. Now, Ukraine had always been the neighbor about which Putin and many Russian elites had been most concerned. Almost a third of the population was Russian-speaking. There were many people in Ukraine, if we go back to 2004, not more recently, but if we go back to 2004, there were many in Ukraine at the time that were actually sorry that it had emerged as an independent entity, who really wanted to be part of a state governed from Moscow, a part of a Russian-led entity. The Russian state, by most accounts, had its origins in Ukraine. Part of Ukraine, at least part of it, had been in the Russian Empire since the 17th century. Most of Ukraine had been part of the Russian Empire since the 18th century, by the end of the 18th century. In Putin's view, and this isn't a new view, even though it's been recently emphasized, Ukrainians and Russians were really a single people. And Ukraine's independence was, as he put it, artificial, the result of a terrible mistake on the part of Putin's predecessor as president of the Russian Federation. And because it was artificial, it was illegitimate. Okay. Ukraine's vast coal reserves supplied a great deal of Russian energy. Since the 1970s, Russia had been exporting gas, its chief source of export revenue, through Ukrainian pipelines to the West. Okay. Russia's most important naval assets were based in Ukraine. So now we've got a Western government in charge, a pro-Western government in charge. And the threat loomed that Ukraine was really going to be the next casualty, that it would very soon join NATO. Okay. Moreover, and this is not to be underestimated, I think, in thinking about Putin's views, the Orange Revolution, which was a democratic revolution, threatened the stability, even the survival of Putin's government. Because in this day and age, a democratic revolution in Ukraine, it was true in the 19th century, it could certainly be true in the 21st century, a democratic revolution in Ukraine might well spark a similar democratic revolution in Russia. That there could be a kind of chain reaction. So now this really became front and center, the focus of Putin's energies, reversing that revolution in Ukraine and once again installing a pro-Russian government. Fourth key moment in this evolution of Russian policy toward its neighbors, very different kind of moment or event. August of 2008. Poland and the Czech Republic agreed to install a missile defense system supplied by the US, part of a NATO-run defensive system, on their territories. Now, from the point of view of NATO, Washington, those missiles were being put there to protect Europe against a possible attack from Iran, which was building a rather advanced intermediate range missile program that would be capable, when the missiles were ready, of striking much of Europe. But Putin's military advisors, at least some of them, I don't know if this is true of all of them, but some of them were telling him these defensive missiles could be used to bring down not just missiles emanating from Iran, but missiles emanating from Russia. And that meant, I don't want to go into this, but it meant that Russia's nuclear deterrent against an attack by NATO members, most important deterrent Russia had, would be undermined if it could effectively be destroyed by missiles stationed in Eastern Europe. Okay. Moreover, again, some in the Russian military advised Putin that, at least some, perhaps all, I don't know, but at least some, advised Putin that these defensive installations could be fairly easily adapted to launch offensive missiles that would attack Russia and Russian territory. So in other words, suddenly in 2008, not so sudden, I mean, the discussion had been in public, but the decision was made. And suddenly, the military threat to NATO was now from NATO was much greater. Now, given that this pro-Western government in Ukraine was becoming very interested and expressing considerable interest in joining NATO, and given that in that same year, 2008, NATO had actually issued a declaration that although not immediately, Ukraine would be on the list for NATO membership. What if you put these threats together? These defensive missiles now might well be erected in Ukraine, right? Thereby posing a particularly acute threat to Russia. Okay? And exposing Moscow, other major population centers, to the possibility of a devastating surprise attack. All right? Fifth key moment in this evolution, last one I'll talk about. Once again, the evolution of Putin's policies toward his neighbors, once again involved Ukraine. That moment is more familiar to Americans today. It's known as Euromaidan, so European independence. It came in February of 2014. By then, Russia, by dint of great effort and a lot of money, had managed to install, once again, a pro-Russian government in Ukraine. Okay? And again, keep in mind now that this is the chief mechanism that Putin is using now. Not soldiers at borders, but influence in an electoral process that the West was also trying to influence, but competitive influence on an electoral process that could result in a pro-Russian leadership of Ukraine. This is Putin's strategy at the time, all right? Prior to February of 2014. So when this pro-Russian government heeded Russian demands that it refused to sign even an agreement with the EU for political association and free trade, we're not even talking NATO here, EU, mass protests again erupted in Ukraine and continued for more than 3 solid months. Okay? Now, it would seem, as far as I can make out, that for Putin, economic ties between Ukraine and the EU, while no way as threatening as NATO membership, were still an unacceptable infringement on Russia's privileged sphere, preventing economic integration of the post-Soviet space. Moreover, life had shown that if you start with EU membership, NATO membership might well be next on the list. Okay, it seemed like one would follow the other in some kind of inevitable procession. But now, 2014, in contrast with previous moments of crisis, Russia had the ability, and again, it was Putin's policy to make sure that this ability would be in place, to deploy military force to achieve its aims in Ukraine. So a vote by the Ukrainian parliament to remove the pro-Russian leader at the time was the trigger that led Russia to seize and annex Crimea, where its precious naval assets were located, and send in troops to assist pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine. And at that time, for the first time, we have tens of thousands of Russian troops stationed on the border with eastern Ukraine. Well, their number waxed and waned rather mysteriously. I always try to understand, well, why this withdrawal and why this, I never fully understood that, but their number waxed and waned. But after 2014, they became a constant presence, serving as a reminder to anyone in doubt that Russia could seize more Ukrainian territory at any time if it chose to do that. So this brings us to the last few months. Okay. So why did Russia now, in the last few months, vastly increase its troop presence on Ukraine's borders, eventually stationing more than 160,000 Russian soldiers and heavy weapons, not only in the east this time, but surrounding Ukraine on all sides? Well, I have to say that I don't know for sure. I'll offer you some speculation as to why this more massive buildup. There had already been a substantial number of troops. Why a lot more? All right. So I can't help thinking that, first of all, well, a fact, the substantial increase in the numbers actually began to occur in late March of 2021. All right, so all of us trying to figure Russia out, you got to ask yourself, what's going on in March of 2021? Well, it's not long after the United States had a new president, right? There's reason to believe, not anything guaranteed, but reason to believe that Russia was concerned that this new president might be more receptive to a Ukrainian bid to join NATO than his predecessor had been. Okay, so this isn't just guesswork. Trump had been famously skeptical about the very existence of NATO, let alone a move to expand it. Overall, he was notably sympathetic to Russia's concerns, eager to placate Putin and avoid offending him. He viewed the supply of American weapons to Ukraine as leverage to induce Ukrainian cooperation, remember, with his efforts to discredit Biden and his son, not as an instrument of policy aimed at strengthening a fledgling democracy. So I think it's quite reasonable to think that Putin feared that Biden might be more receptive to Ukraine's plea for additional weapons and military trainers. Moreover, as is well known, Trump was notably skeptical of NATO, eager to withdraw American troops from Europe, and determined not to allow the alliance to embrace any more new members. Okay. Biden, on the other hand, was a longtime stalwart supporter of America's commitment to the alliance and a believer in the need for a strong NATO alliance. Okay. So I don't know, but I'm guessing that the initial buildup from an already high level of about 24,000, the initial buildup began, this we know, and it may have been intended as a deterrent to any American move to strengthen Ukraine's military capabilities or enhance the American military presence in Russia's other neighbors, the Baltic states and Poland. Well, I think we all know the buildup had the exact opposite effect. In June of last year, this isn't so well known, the United States came out in support of a closer relationship between Ukraine and NATO. Ukraine was granted the status of an enhanced opportunity partner. That is, an aspiring member. These are all official terms in NATO's jargon. They're not miscellaneous. They're very, very specific. Ukraine was bumped up. It wasn't widely publicized, but it was known. Any NATO document said it. Ukraine was bumped up to be among the first in line, officially the first in line, to become a NATO member. And as a so-called, using NATO jargon, an aspiring member, it would be given opportunities to participate in alliance operations, not just a presence, as Ukraine had had in Afghanistan, but actually working together with NATO forces, thereby gathering valuable training and experience and enhancing the interoperability of Ukrainian forces and those of NATO. Okay. We also know that Biden authorized the Pentagon to announce a new $125 million military aid package to Ukraine, including some fairly sophisticated, albeit defensive weapons. Okay. Ukrainian President Zelensky was invited to visit the US in September of 2021. And in advance of the visit, the US promised another $60 million in military aid. Zelensky used that visit, much of it, to press for rapid Ukrainian membership in NATO. Well, Washington, at least publicly, resisted those pleas, but it did send warships to the Black Sea in a gesture of support, quite an offense to Russia in its attempt to control its neighborhood. And in September of 2021, NATO actually conducted joint military exercises with Ukrainian forces. Okay. So back to Putin. From Putin's point of view, NATO, and particularly American policies, were obstructing the realization of his critical objective, the maintenance of a privileged sphere of influence in which Ukraine would play a central role. Okay. And with American backing, NATO's connection with Ukraine was intensifying, frustrating Putin's determination to keep the alliance at bay and maintain a robust buffer zone between its forces and those of Russia. Another aspect of Biden's policies may also have played a role in the initial buildup of Russian forces, as well as the steady continuation of the process in subsequent months. Putin had been angered by Trump's decision to abandon what was a cornerstone of the post-Cold War arms control regime, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Agreement that banned intermediate and short-range nuclear forces in Europe. So the US had pulled out over strong Russian objections in 2019. So I can only imagine that Putin was hoping that maybe Biden would agree to restore that treaty. The Russian military, we know, was worried that in the absence of such a treaty, the US would once again deploy intermediate range nuclear forces on the European continent and possibly even on the territory of new NATO members. Okay. While Trump was in office, the US military had been working on new, more precise, short-range missiles and extremely fast hypersonic intermediate-range missiles. Putin might have hoped that these programs would be canceled under Biden. They weren't, okay? And now were NATO to incorporate Ukraine, these very sophisticated, very fast weapons might be placed on Ukrainian territory, along with missile defense systems, posing a new and grave danger to Russia, emanating from its own neighborhood. So Russia's massive troop buildup on Ukraine's borders may have been intended, in part, to prevent a development like this, and more broadly, to induce the United States to keep those weapons out of Europe altogether. And evidence for that motivation may be found in the fact that Putin's emissaries have made such demands in meetings with Biden administration officials. Get on with signing a new intermediate forces agreement and keep these weapons out of Europe. In other words, I can only think that Putin may have concluded by the end of 2021 that massive troop deployments threatening Ukraine were the only way to induce Washington and Brussels to take Russia's concerns seriously. Ultimately, the decision to invade probably reflected Putin's belief that it was only going to be, that was the only way. Nothing else was going to work. This is the only way he could install a loyal and durable government in Ukraine, one that would acknowledge and maintain consistently Ukraine's close historical ties with Russia, and wouldn't be swept aside in yet another wave of Western-sponsored democratization that might threaten even Putin's hold on power at home. The invasion probably also reflected Putin's conviction that only this kind of escalation, okay, that is, an invasion, and not the mere presence of Russian troops. Remember, they'd already been on Ukraine's border for several months in large numbers, but they weren't doing it. Only an invasion would induce the United States and NATO to alter the behavior that threatened Russia, to halt their seemingly relentless march toward the extension of NATO membership to Ukraine, to stop providing more and more military assistance to Ukraine, to abandon plans to install missile defense systems or sophisticated offensive weapons on Ukrainian soil, and withdraw troops and weapon systems, not just from Ukraine, but from former Soviet and former Warsaw Pact states. That's my best guess. Questions? Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you.
What do you think Putin's gonna do in the next few weeks now? The Russian economy just plumped.
I was afraid somebody would ask me that. I don't know. I told you. I mean, did I tell you? I was surprised. Lots of people had asked me, are they going to invade? Are they going to invade? And my answer had always been, I don't know, but if pressed, I don't think so, because the costs seemed too high. It seemed like any rational calculus of economic, military, political costs would just say, this is irrational. And yes, I was operating on the assumption that despite his rage and his emotion, his character, what have you, that he was a rational calculator. So with that assumption, I guessed wrong. So at this point, with nuclear threats being issued twice now in the space of about a little over a week, do I know what's going to happen next? I don't. I will say that as I watched the footage on the bombing of Ukraine, and particularly of Kiev and Kharkiv, it reminds me of his policies in Chechnya. The way he won that second Chechen war was completely to level, utterly destroy the capital of Chechnya at the time, Grozny. And will Kiev be another Grozny? I certainly wouldn't rule that out. Then how far? Will there be a long-term occupation? If so, how many troops? What part of Ukraine? How will he ensure? The ultimate goal being to ensure pro-Russian, durable pro-Russian government in Ukraine. What Putin will think is necessary to accomplish that, I don't know. Putin's sensitivity to a package of sanctions that honestly, again, I was wrong. I didn't think NATO would be, or the EU would be so unified. I didn't think Germany would halt the Nord Stream 2 project. I don't think Putin thought so either. So will the pressure of the sanctions dissuade him, or will it actually anger him even further? I gather from one thing I read that Putin erupted when he heard one of the latest sets of sanctions with fury. How dare they? So, if his fury may know no bounds, and what he'll do, I don't know, but I don't know. I don't know what will happen. I can't predict. Yeah, Gabe.
You recently said in answer to the previous question that you said that Putin's rational decision-making, or rational calculus should dissuade him from pursuing the invasion. But then you also previously said that during the troop buildups, it seems like from my perspective and maybe other people's perspective, that he was already on the pathway to gaining concessions from the West. What do you think kind of stimulated the decision to turn the conflict from a non-kinetic one to starting to roll in the tanks?
So I think he seems to have reached the conclusion that the Minsk process was just not going to work. In other words, I don't want to go into great detail, but there had been an agreement that Ukrainians had signed that could possibly, under some interpretations, have given so much influence and autonomy to the Donetsk and Luhansk that it would have prevented, they would have been able to prevent Ukrainian policy from, or prevent the joining of NATO. I think, and it seems to me clear from this famous now Public Security Council session that he led, that he reached the conclusion, we're just not going to do it. The troops we have there are not persuading Ukraine to make the necessary concessions, so we got to do something else. That's my guess again, but it's no more than a sort of halfway educated guess. I don't really know. Yes?
Do you think Putin's worries stem more so from preventing the onslaught of a domino effect of democracy within Europe? Or would you say that they stem more so from Ukrainian susceptibility to entering NATO?
So did you hear the question? Is Putin more worried about the domino effect of a domestic democratic revolution in Ukraine or about yes and yes? He's worried about both. He always has been. He's always been worried about both dimensions. It's very distinctively Putinian, just coined a new word, worldview, that they're both of tremendous existential danger to him, to Russia, not just him, though. I mean, it's also a belief that Russia needs what he calls a managed democracy. I don't want to go into what that could possibly mean. There are a number of ideologues in Russia that have talked about that. But what it is not very democratic, to say the least. It's democratic in form only. He'd always believed that this was essential for Russia. And he wasn't alone. So it's hard to say which was a more acute danger in Putin's eyes, NATO membership or the dissolution of the existing Russian regime and its replacement by a chaotic mob-ruled. Remember, when he looked at the Orange Revolution, Euromaidan, what he saw was mob rule, the last thing he wanted for Russia. So I wouldn't in any way say one was necessarily more important than the other. They both were, I think. Again, a guess. He has not consulted me. So, yes.
Long term, how does the rift between the West and Russia and whatnot in its area of sphere of influence, how do we deal with those two groups with so much power, so diametrically opposed, in their policies and goals? How does the world deal with that going forward?
How do we deal with an authoritarian and aggressive Russia? Is that kind of your question? I don't really know. I'm just rephrasing it so I can understand.
Yeah, I guess, with the Western Europe, the United States, and Russia seemingly having such, different goals for the same area in the world.
Oh, I see. How can the two...
How do we deal with that long term when they both possess...
That's an excellent question.
Power, nuclear weapons.
I think they're irreconcilable. That's the whole point here, is that this is an irreconcilable conflict. You can't have both a free and democratic, self-governing, sovereign state in Ukraine and have also a Ukraine which is docile and dominated by Russia. And ultimately, as an answer to that question, ultimately not really a democracy. Okay, you can't have both. You can't have a real flourishing democracy and a not real flourishing democracy. They're not consistent. These are it's not the first time in history that major powers have had irreconcilable ambitions, and they don't always lead to war. Sometimes both sides just say, better that we not fight about it. But you're quite right in sort of identifying an irreconcilable conflict there. Luke?
So we've also talked about how Putin wants regime change. Does he have a certain Ukrainian in mind to take charge if you guys take over Ukraine, and how strong of
A certain person?
Yeah. Does he have like a certain puppet he favors in Ukraine?
So I've been sort of watching, it's not the main focus of my attention, but has he been interested in reinstalling Yanukovych, who fled in Euromaidan, but who had been, pretty reliably pro-Russian. But I don't know. I haven't really seen the sign that he's grooming Yanukovych to make a triumphant return to Kyiv and take over. There may be another candidate. Other folks are speculating about somebody else. So I'm sure he's got somebody in mind, but I don't know for sure who that would be. Other questions or yes, sir.
How did Russia actually close the opposite side or the enemy of the United States? Because I know before Putin goes on the position, become the president.
How did Russia become an enemy of the United States?
Yes, because after the Soviet Union collapsed,
Yes.
like before they collapsed, they want to try to become westernized, become capitalism to risk economy, but they failed. But and then the Putin got the position, but he was wanting to be close to the West, but finally he's right here right now gets like the whole enemy over there.
Well, I have to say that the United States, Putin and a lot of Russian elites were talking about the U.S. as an enemy and NATO as an enemy long before the U.S. and NATO were talking about Russia as an enemy. I kept wondering when it would become reciprocal. The Russian rhetoric was very, very aggressive, even going back to 2004. The American Obama talks about resets and so forth, and I'm sort of wondering, and everybody's beginning to focus on China and not Russia and pivot away from the rest of the world to Asia, and I'm wondering, when are folks waking up that the Russians view us, and certainly NATO collectively, as enemy number one? But when did that sense of, so it was always there on Putin's part. Remember, for the first 10 years, he wasn't president of the Russian Federation. Much more pro-Western, Boris Yeltsin was. So, but also Putin had not been consistently anti-American. In the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, he was among the very first, if not the first leader, to call President Bush, offer his sympathies, offer intelligence, declaring at one point in 2001 that Russia and the U.S. would now become strategic partners. I still remember when that happened. So it wasn't always there. I think the expansion to the Baltics of NATO was a critical moment. It wasn't suddenly overnight, but it started a transformation that this isn't possible. There was opposition to the war in Iraq, but no greater than that, evidenced by Germany and France at the time in 2003. 2004, things change. And that's why I put the incorporation of the Baltic states as such a critical moment, a sense of betrayal. You can talk about, oh, NATO isn't really anti-Russian. Yeah, well, why is it taking from us states that were part of the former Soviet Union? So I'm guessing that was a key trigger moment, but it wasn't black and white overnight. And of course, the enmity between the United States and the Soviet Union goes back decades, almost to the Bolshevik Revolution for a whole variety of other reasons. But I think that probably answers your question as best I can. How am I doing on time?
5 minutes.
I guess I have a couple more minutes, maybe. Is there any other question? Yes, sir.
So I think in the West we often view like Putin's tactics as kind of strong arm sort of tactics to exert pressure over his neighbors, but in their sphere of influence. But in the United States, in recent history, do we at times think that we have our sphere of influence and we need to exert pressure over our sphere of influence and keep things out? Like I know we did.
Right. Are we immune to the notion and the quest for a sphere of influence? No way. What do you think the Monroe Doctrine was articulating? Right. No, this isn't a uniquely Russian invention by any means, as the Russians will be among the first to tell you.
Yeah.
Right.
So does that mean that? So does that mean that Russia has some idea of legitimacy? Because the United States.
Yes, I do. I do. I think that it was a viewpoint that actually was supported very explicitly by Winston Churchill at the end of World War II, that great powers will inevitably have a sphere of influence. That's the way international relations works. It is a formula for stability as long as each recognizes the sphere of the other. And so I do think that that idea that not only that we are entitled to a sphere of influence. That's what great powers do. That's what they create. And as a great power, we should be entitled. Yeah, I do think that's true. Is there another, or do I, again, cut me off if I...
No, you're fine for now.
Okay. So, yes.
With Ukrainian President Zelensky pressing to fast track their entrance to NATO, do you believe NATO will sit on this and kind of see what Putin plays out, or do you think that they'll play into Ukraine's entrance to scare Putin into knowing that he'll have to deal with the other countries?
I think you're asking, do I think that current events, recent events, will lead to a more accelerated admission of NATO? Oh, that's another tricky one. I mean, I also don't know a whole lot about NATO decision making on that, but that's a big step. You could argue it both ways, that Ukraine has demonstrated to NATO that it is defending democracy in Europe. It is bearing the brunt of Russian power. And if anyone deserves membership, Ukraine does. Or you could say, what an alarm bell. Imagine if Ukraine had already been in NATO. And a part of the answer to your question has to depend on the outcome on the ground in Ukraine. If in the end Russia is successful in controlling government decision-making in Kiev, well, if a bid for NATO membership is just not going to happen. It's not even going to be put forward. So again, I have to beg. There are too many plausible scenarios here for me to be able to say that one and not that one. Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you so much. You've been a great